Okay, so nervous system. um, the only organisms that have a nervous system are the animal kingdom. In other words, all the animals except for um, sponges, which are the basal group at the animal kingdom. Everything else has a nervous system. They don't necessarily have a central nervous system. A lot of them have like a neural net. Jellyfish, for example. So there's no brain, but there are certainly neural tissue sending signals. Okay. All vertebrates have a central nervous system. Um, and vertebrates also, besides having a notochord, they also have vertebrae, which are bones that protect them, and they have, of course, a brain, which is well protected as well. So, coordinates all the muscles involved in the functioning of organs, including the heart, the lungs, the bladder, all the muscles, and all the organ systems for the most part. Rapid contraction of muscles. In many cases, you don't even need to think about it. Processes information by the senses. And the brain also functions as an executive function for planning and things like that. Okay. So there's two parts of the nervous system that we're going to learn about. One is the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and they're both well protected with bone. The brain with the cranium, skull, and the spinal cord has a large. Our brain is probably the largest, if you account for size of the organism. Our brain is the largest brain of all animals, except for perhaps Neanderthals were about the same. Whether they were as smart as humans or as dumb as humans is hard to say. So, the brain has a whole bunch of different parts that are dedicated to different things like the visual system, language, motor system, as I mentioned, executive function, all that. Spinal cord, there's a nerve cord, that's the notochord, that is then protected with vertebrae. And it's all nerve fibers up and down, and it helps the brain communicate with the peripheral nervous system, which is the nerves throughout the body. So it's a filter, and it carries information. Okay, and then the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, consists of sensory organs plus the nerves. So we have sensory neurons, like in, let's say, our fingertips, and if we touch a hot stove, those fire and then connect to inner neurons. So, exception, the retinal, optic, olfactory nerves are part of the CNS. So they're actually considered part of the brain. Converts stimuli from the sensory organs into input, and send signals back and forth from organ systems. So the brain, the stomach, after you eat, certain signals are sent to the brain telling you you're satiated and your hunger goes away. See. Okay. So, exception. The retina, optic, and olfactory are part of the central nervous system. Okay. Okay. So, this is the nervous system. The sensory input in red arrows travels along sensory neurons in the PNS. That's the peripheral nervous system. Okay. And then there the information may proceed and be acted on, or more often sent on to the brain for additional integration, interpretation, and command signals from the brain, blue, travel back down the spinal cord, where they are passed on to the motor neurons. Okay. So let's take a look. So sensory organs of the brain receive signals from the receptors in the body. The thalamus, part of the brain, specialized structure in the middle of the brain, filters and sorts signals coming from the PNS via the spinal cord. Okay, so it's kind of a central system where everything comes and then things are sent out to other parts. In response, the motor areas of the brain send commands to this PNS, and that includes the cerebellum, which we'll get to. And then that's sent back down to the motor neurons and the effectors, which are the muscles and things like that, and organs. And then you can see, so there's a brain, the spinal cord, all these major branches coming out of it, and all these other things. These are all part of the peripheral nervous system. So in pink, the CNS, in green, and PNS, peripheral nervous system. These motor signals may stimulate or inhibit muscles, organs, and endocrine cells, but it depends on the kind of signal they get and how strong it is. So not all signals that, let's say, our receptors, our receptor neurons detect are necessarily passed on if they're not very strong. So which part of the nervous system do sensory neurons in your eye? Actually, the retinal neurons are actually part of the central nervous system. To which part of the nervous system does the spinal cord belong? Central nervous system. The reflex arc, we haven't gone over that yet, so but there are things where you don't have to think about, you just respond, including squinting at bright light, flinching at a loud sound, a rapidly moving object, burning yourself, things like that. Okay, so the peripheral sense receptors, these are neural tissue, and they are designed to receive input from different kinds of senses, including chemicals, so like taste and smell, photoreceptors, light, mechanoreceptors, physical changes, touching, hearing, proprioception, body position, balance, things like that. Thermoreceptors moderate your heat and cold, including gradations of heat and cold. And then those things tell the brain, let's say you're getting overheated, then the brain then causes the blood vessels to relax and expand, and you can offload heat. Pain receptors, so pain is central. If we didn't know that we were hurt, we would continue to be injured. There are some people actually who have a mutation where they don't feel pain, and they tend to get injured and not realize it. So it's not just pain, by the way, it's also itching is a form of pain. Electroreceptors, electrical fields, muscle contractions, and all that. And these are actually, it's not like wires, it's actually ions, positively or negatively charged ions that carry that information. And then there's also some animals that actually are able to generate electric fields, like electric eels and a bunch of other kinds of fish that don't use them for shocking, but just for being able to detect things in their world. And then magnetoreceptors, so for detecting magnetic fields, like a lot of organisms have this, so they can actually migrate. Okay. Electro and mechanoreceptors are found in many animals, including most vertebrates. They are not known to be active in humans, however, but we're not sure. Page, chemoreceptors, photoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, all. Peripheral nervous system. So the two different main parts of the nervous system are central and peripheral. Gathers sensory input from the external internal environment, sends it to the central nervous systems. There's sensory neurons, including all the different kinds seen in the previous and interneurons, which carry those signals from the sensory neurons either to motor neurons or to the brain, the central nervous system, rather. Okay. So, integrates and processes a central nervous system, generates a signal in the response dictating particular action or motor output. PNS relays the signal to the body part that will complete the action. Interneurons and motor neurons that activate muscles or organ systems or all that. And then the effectors are muscles or organs that perform all the different things that need to be done to keep us alive. So again, sensory neurons receive information. Neurons integrate information and activate motor neurons. Motor neurons activate muscles and organ systems. And effectors are muscles or organ systems that perform the desired response. Okay. So there's something called the reflex arc, and this is part of our system that doesn't involve the central nervous system. And there are certain things we want to respond to without thinking about it, that we have to respond to or would be in trouble. Okay? So things like flinching, detecting movement, let's say we see a monster come in the room. We don't even have to think about it. What should I do? It's mainly run, okay? Fight or flight response, that sort of thing. Blinking, all these kinds of reflexes that we don't have to think about. They involve sensory neurons. Our senses, some cue or signal comes in, let's say touch, we burn ourselves, it comes in, it goes to an interneuron, it then is transferred, instead of the central nervous system, it goes to a motor neuron. Okay, so here's our hot stimulus. Hot, okay. So the sensory neuron senses heat, right? The interneuron carries the signal. Or relays the signal, and then the motor neuron withdraws the hand. There. Okay? So, they go sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, effector, the response to it. Knee tap response, reaction to unexpected painful stimuli, salivation, gag response, as examples. Does not require consciousness or cognition. You don't have to be aware and thinking about it. It takes too long to think and decide in certain things. So what's in our head? That's a good question. People have been pondering that for a long time. Okay, so there's bunches of different parts of the brain, but there's three main sections: forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. The brain is composed of two kinds of neural tissue: gray matter, the cell bodies of neurons, and the white matter, including the axons that connect the cell bodies of neural projections, the dendrites and axons, and winding tendrils that connect one neuron to the other. So, cerebrum, we can actually see what these things are. Cerebrum. Okay. Controls language, memory, sensations, decision making, including in the forebrain. The thalamus in here, different color. Hypothalamus, pituitary gland. You can see the forebrain, that's the cerebrum, thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, midbrain, or the midbrain and the hindbrain. Amygdala, hippocampus for the midbrain, and reticular formation, and then the hindbrain. Hypothalamus controls center for sex drive, pleasure, pain, hunger, thirst, blood pressure, body temperature. Okay. The brainstem is the part of the brain that connects the brain to the spinal cord. Cerebellum, responsible for balance, muscle, movement, coordination. There's the skull, cerebral spinal fluid. So our brain is encased in fluid. Protects us. Brainstem governs heartbeat, breathing, swallowing, other automatic functions. Don't have to think about them. We don't have to tell our cells, oh, beat, heart, beat, beat, beat. No. Okay. So the spinal column is encased in a vertebral column, right? And the spinal column is all neurons. The brain has the skull, the meninges, which is the surrounding fluid. Let's see. White matter, cerebral cortex, pia matter, bonus skull, meningeal layer. It's another layer inside the skull. And then there's something called the blood-brain barrier that controls what can actually get into the brain. So it keeps out larger chemicals, it keeps out foreign invaders like microbes, things like that. So transmitting signals, this is looking at neurons specifically. So a neuron receives information from other cells, including other neurons, through one or more dendrites. In other words, these are the dendrites. Okay, this whole section. Okay. And The dendrites collect information from the other neurons. The cell body contains all of the structures common to animal cells. So the cell bodies are actually the white matter. The dendrites and the axons are part of the gray matter. The signal travels from the dendrites down through the axon. The axon conducts the signal away from the cell body. And then there are the axon terminals that transmit information to other cells, other neurons. Okay, so this is the dendrites are at the head. The terminal part is these here, and these connect. If we were to actually these connect to another neuron, but there's actually a gap in between, and it's called the synapse, and we'll get to that. Okay. So, action potential. In other words, how do signals travel down neurons, and then how are they transmitted to other neurons? Well, there's something called an action potential, nerve impulse. So it's the entry, in this case, of sodium ions, Na, that are positive into the cell, causing a chain reaction that propagates along the length of the axon. And also involves sodium as well as potassium as K. Okay, so these things, like right here, right now it's being passed down all the way finally down all the way here and transmitted. And you can see what happens. The sodium kind of displaces the potassium, and then all the negative charges are negative ions that are also involved. Okay, so the signal, this ionic signal, has to be strong enough. There may be a very mild signal that starts out, but it doesn't, and it's not strong enough to be actually propagated all the way down. So, how do neurons look different? Well, they have long extensions with functions. Dendrites and axons are used to receive information. Okay. Some people are born without the capacity to feel pain, although it sound nice. It's a bad situation. You could see what would happen. You might dunk yourself in hot water and not know it. Okay, so many neurons have axons covered in myelin sheath, made up of Schwann cells, and it turns out it helps nerve impulses travel faster, and there's no leakage when axons are covered in myelin sheaths. Okay, and they're generally considered part of the white matter of the brain. They can be much longer than unmyelinated axons. So, for example, we might actually have an unmyelinated axon. Here's the terminal, and then here's the dendrite head, right? And instead of having all those Schwann cells, like here, right, there's none. And so these axons tend to be shorter in length, and otherwise they would lose too much of the signal. Also, people with multiple sclerosis, it's called an autoimmune disease. We'll learn more about that in the next section. But it's a case where our immune system is actually attacking our own cells. In other words, it's for some reason detects our cells as non-self instead of self. And in multiple sclerosis, the immune system is actually attacking the myelin cells surrounding the axons, and that's why over time people with multiple sclerosis have more and more trouble with neurological problems, because there's too much leakage in the neurons and the axons. So the Schwann cells collectively make up the myelin sheath. Okay. Now, when two neurons connect, they're not actually connected physically. What they do is they meet in a very small area called the synapse. So once the signal reaches the axon terminal, right here, okay, it triggers the release of these chemicals. They're kind of like hormones. They're called neurotransmitters, and they're released into the space between the two neurons. So up here, so this is the terminal. All these vesicles contain neurotransmitters, okay, and then the actual head of the dendrite of the next one is right here, and they have receptors that receive these neurotransmitters. And once the receptors are full, when they're no longer needed, they're digested, the enzymes by enzymes, and recycled. Okay. So what happens is the electrical signal, in terms of ions, plus and minus ions, like the sodium or the potassium, is now turned into a chemical signal in terms of the neurotransmitters that propagate across from the terminal of one neuron to the head of the other. Okay, and these are all neurotransmitters, chemicals. So, okay, also, so that's transmission of an impulse across the synapse, and then what happens is once the signal has crossed, the neurotransmitters have to be removed from the synapse, and they're digested by enzymes, and then they're also reuptake and used again. Here, once the signal has been transmitted with the neurotransmitters all the way across, they are then released and reuptake. In other words, taken back up into the terminal to be used again. And so the concentration in the synapse is reduced. There are a number of different neurotransmitters. You've probably heard some of them: serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, gamma, glutamate. Many diseases, mental diseases, and neurological diseases are linked to problems with different neurotransmitters depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, Parkinson's. Parkinson's is more a matter of not so much mental illness as neural impulses not traveling properly. Some of these things can be treated with drugs that alter the level of specific neurotransmitters. In other words, when we get drugs, let's say for depression, like SSRIs, these drugs actually work on the neurotransmitters and not on the actual neurons. Okay, and so what they do is they either block neurotransmitters or get more release. Remember, so let's take a look. So SSRIs, that works on the serotonin system, and they're called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI. And what they do is they block, okay, but if the drug like Prozac or Zoloft or whatever, what they do is they actually block the reuptake, and we end up with a higher concentration of these neurotransmitters instead of being taken back up, because they're effectively blocked by these drugs. For some reason that helps in terms of depression and things like that. So they work by preventing serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter, from being recycled, stays in the synapse longer. So most drugs that affect the nervous system do so because they can affect the levels of specific neurotransmitters. Okay, that's how they work. The drugs work on the neurotransmitters. Drugs that inhibit reuptake allow the neurotransmitter to remain longer in the synapse. Drugs that affect serotonin. Okay. Some drugs cause release of stored neurotransmitters. Okay? So even more is released into the synapse. Others can mimic the neurotransmitter itself, activating the receptors on the postsynaptic cell. So there's all these different ways for different drugs to work. A lot of the recreational drugs, especially the psychedelics like ecstasy and LSD, they work on the serotonin system also, and they cause some of the effects by working on these neurotransmitters. Attention deficit disorder, that's a problem with the dopamine system. So there's different kinds of neurons that use different kinds of neurotransmitters. Some release and use serotonin, others dopamine. Dopamine is usually associated with certain illegal drugs that give you a sense of well-being, like opiates. Low levels of dopamine are associated with supposedly attention deficit disorder, possibly due to excess of reuptake transporters. So perhaps Ritalin blocks the reuptake. And Ritalin works in the same way as cocaine, all on the dopamine neurotransmitter system. So, why are some drugs addictive and why are some drugs not? Well, a drug is more likely to be addictive if its effects are immediate, right? So, obviously, let's say you're smoking hashish or marijuana, you get an immediate effect. Okay? If you eat it, it takes a little bit longer, but still pretty good. And usually you get some kind of feeling that makes it feel good. Okay? We'll call it euphoria. And for the most part, most of these drugs are short, short duration, not long acting. But it depends. Marijuana and THC, maybe a couple of hours. LSD, 8 hours, 9 hours. Mushrooms, about that. Cocaine, 45 minutes. So, depends. Okay. And also, in terms of addiction, is it capable of inducing tolerance and withdrawal? In other words, let's say with opiates, you're using heroin or oxytocin. Over time, to get the high, you need more and more of the opiate. Okay? And so oftentimes with long-term users, if the amount that they took if it was ingested by someone who was a new user, it would probably kill them right off. Also, it changes the neurotransmitters, and oftentimes over a long period of time. And so if you're off the drug, there's oftentimes a withdrawal symptom. In fact, it also happens with SSRIs. There are some drugs that are very hard. You have to taper them off very, very, very slowly. Otherwise, you get some secondary withdrawal effects. So, drugs that alter behavior do so by altering neurotransmitter signaling. When used appropriately, these drugs can be used to treat disorders. Some work better than others. There are both legal and illegal drugs that can act on the same neurotransmitters, but the exact mechanism or dynamics are different. Dopamine, Ritalin, cocaine, methadone, amphetamines, things like that. Serotonin, SSRIs, ecstasy, LSD, and addiction has to do with the timing of the drug's action and the effects. So, methadone is kind of an opiate substitute, and it actually doesn't get people high, but it keeps them from suffering withdrawal effects. Okay, so I've been talking about neurons and nervous system, and there's some interesting things. It turns out a lot of parasites and pathogens use mind control in animals to enhance transmission from one individual to another. Okay? Probably one of the best known is rabies. Rabies is a disease of the central nervous system. An animal that gets it tends to become very aggressive and bite other animals and transmits the virus that way. And so the virus kind of turns the mind into an aggressive machine. Okay? So that's one example. There's two others we're going to cover here. There's two videos I want you to watch. They're both on Canvas under Chapter 24, under Slides and Media. One is Cordyceps, Attack of the Killer Fungi. You can get a link to it on Canvas, or you can put this in your browser. And the other one is about a disease called toxoplasmosis that cats and mice transmit. So we'll go to those. the first thing, watch cordyceps attack of the killer fungi on ants. It's really quite remarkable. Okay, so animals that come into contact with cat feces can become infected with this parasite. It's a eukaryotic parasite, single celled, that has a nucleus, and it infects all kinds of different mammals, humans as well. Usually, not the infection is not serious. Our immune system clears it, or the parasite is encysted that so it can't get out. Okay, but the normal life cycle is between mice and cats. So, rodents that have been infected by this parasite are attracted to cat odors and cat urine. And they, not only do they have slower reaction times, but like I mentioned, the mice get attracted to the odor, to the cat urine, and instead of being afraid, they get infected. They become desired. In other words, they want to have sex with the cat. It's not a good idea. Suicide by cat. Now, one of the things that Gandhi does in terms of changing the mouse is that it actually releases its own form of dopamine that enhances the loving feeling of the mouse. Now, dopamine is another neurotransmitter that we were talking about earlier. And so the parasite itself manufactures dopamine and releases it, and that actually affects the behavior of the mammal infected. So if you could watch that video, that'd be great. And that's about it.